Mini lecture today, what I wanted to talk to you about was environmental auditing. And the slides in the background for this lecture is shipping containers. So 38,000 shipping containers, which really illustrate the amount of goods that we ship around the world and indeed some of our environmental impacts. So in the lecture today, what I wanted to talk to you about was environmental reporting and environmental auditing. So this links straight to your assessment for the course. So I'll talk a little bit about the Global Reporting Initiative, or the GRI, and then talk to you about the audit that you need to do and what some of the activities that you'll be doing are. So first of all, when we talk about sustainability reporting, a lot of organisations are now reporting on their sustainability performance. So we're seeing much more widespread practice of this, whereas previously very few organisations were looking at reporting on their sustainability performance. More and more organisations are starting to do so, especially among the largest organisations. So the formats vary. So your organisations might have sustainability reports and they might be integrated with annual reports, they might be standalone reports, they might be annual, they might be biannual. There's lots of different formats. They can be in print, on the web, however it might be. And there's no one standard really of what a sustainability report should look like, and no universally accepted standard. The Global Reporting Initiative is one way that organisations are starting to be able to benchmark or compare across time as well as across other organisations. So the Global Reporting Initiative, or the GRI, came out of the series principles. So they were developed in the late 1990s. There were about 10 principles looking at a range of different issues, so from environmental to social issues. And the aim of the GRI is really to provide this framework for organisations to give their environmental reports in a way that's both credible, trustworthy, and it can, as I said before, it can be used to benchmark and demonstrate their environmental performance and their social performance also, and also to compare across time. And another aim of the GRI is really to ensure that this framework is applicable to a wide range of organisations. So when I spoke in the last lecture about environmental management systems, it had tended to be those larger organisations. Well, one of the key missions of the GRI is to ensure that this framework fits across any size, sector or location in these organisations. So now what I wanted to do in linking the GRI or sustainability reporting generally is talk about environmental auditing. So an audit can be a way to inform the data and provide the data that goes behind that environmental report. And this is one of the key things that you'll have to do in the course. So an environmental audit is this tool in order to provide that data. So the definition here from Thomas, a management tool comprising systematic, documented, periodic and objective evaluation of how well environmental organisation, management and equipment are performing with the aim of helping to safeguard the environment. So it's really a key tool when we're looking at environmental management. So looking at facilitating the control of environmental practices as well as assessing compliance. So the aim of the audit is to collect data and evaluate the performance of the organisation against a certain set of criteria, whatever they may be. You might choose the GRI, you might choose other sorts of criteria. So the audit needs to be very methodical and methodologically sound. So one of the key things you're going to have to do is develop that method, and you'll need to do that when you're developing your environmental audit plan, which is the first group assessment. So it really needs to be a very rigorous and valid process. When you were looking at the module earlier in the course on changing behaviour, one of the things I talked about in that module was this idea of measurement and needing to measure at the level of behaviour change. And so this is similar in that it's still about measurement. So we really want to get that sound data, the analysis and the testing of that data to ensure it is measuring exactly what we want it to measure. So some key things in the audit process, first of all, independence. So this idea of impartiality, the objectivity of the audit conclusions need to be very sound. And also evidence, providing that rational base, so an evidence base of the data that's informing decision making, informing policy for the organisation. So the things that you need to do. So first of all, audit planning. So going over the objectives, the scope and the criteria, and contacting the auditee. So if you're operating from outside the organisation, you need to contact the organisation to discuss and set up that particular audit. You might choose to do an audit at the organisation that you're working for, and that's fine too. But you need to let that organisation know that that's what's going to happen. One of the key things you really need to do is set the objectives and the scope. So you've got a short amount of time to do this audit, so I'd suggest you set the scope quite narrowly. In the past, past students have done audits on things from as small as the amount of paper that's used and the way paper is used in their particular office area, through to looking at the amount of diesel that's used and wasted in Queensland Rail's operations. So very broad range of audit scope, but make sure you set that scope in a way that makes the audit manageable for you. Then you need to conduct your pre-audit activities and do a document review also. So what information can you get now on the organisation that might help you in the audit? Do they have an environmental management system in place? Is there some data that's collected from that process? And then if you're going to do some sort of data collection and observation, some interviews as part of your audit, the pre-audit activity also requires you to do some preparation for that. So you might develop an interview schedule, some check sheets for measuring the impacts or indicators that you're going to look at. So preparing for those on-site activities. The next thing is actually going on site. So this is where you'll do your observations, you'll collect your data, you might do interviews, some discussions with staff, whatever it might be, that's up to you to decide what will influence or give you the most data that and the richest data that you need, and then conducting that data collection. The fourth step, developing and preparing the audit report. So this is where you put the data in to your report, you analyse it, you might present it in graphs or tables across time, whatever it might be, and then make some recommendations on what you think the organisation could do to act on the results that you've found. And then audit follow-up. So identifying improvements for future audits, and for you also doing a reflection on what you could have done better or what you might do better next time. So in terms of this, putting this in context for your assessment, the things that you'll need to do for your audit plan and the presentation that you need to give are really these first two things. So the audit planning and then the pre-audit activities. So identifying that objective scope and the criteria that you're going to use. And then also obtaining any background information and developing up those measures or indicators for your particular audit. Then you conduct the audit on site. So once you've finished the course, you can go and finished all of the modules, go and do that audit on site. And when you're presenting your audit report, you need to cover all 5 of these points. And that will be in the structure. I have put some examples of audits from previous years in this content for this particular module. There are a few different audit types. So an internal audit is where you might do an audit on the organisation that you're currently working for. So it's low cost, there's not much disruption for the organisation, you'll have familiarity with the way the organisation works, and there's good opportunities for cross-transfer of information. So you'll have access to information that you might not otherwise have if you'd been coming from outside the organisation. The disadvantages there are that you're less independent, so you can't give as much of that objective view of what's going on in the organisation as you could if you were outside of it. And also often the least audit expertise. So that depends on your own experience, but often we get internal auditors who are doing the audit within their organisation without any of the experience or skills from having done it elsewhere. The external auditor, kind of the flip side, the most independent and often has the most audit experience, but it's much more high cost, so you might employ a consultant. It can be disruptive for the organisation where someone has to come in and sit or work with staff members. There's low opportunity for information transfer, less time that the auditor is there on site, and little operational familiarity, so not knowing the way things work within the organisation. Some sort of cross between those you can overcome some of the disadvantages of both, but it can be quite disruptive to put those two together. So you might have a combination. So maybe if you're working in pairs, you might have one auditor who is within the organisation and one who's out, in order to get that benefit of a cross audit type. In terms of audit planning, I've mentioned this already, but what you really need to do in order to give your presentation effectively, come up with your audit objectives. So what are you trying to do? Are you trying to set a baseline? Are you trying to compare to previous data? And then what is the scope of the audit? Are you going to look at all of the nation, if it's a nationwide organisation, that entire nation's operations, or just one particular site? Are you going to look at all energy use or just one type of energy use? Setting the scope is entirely up to you, but make sure you set a scope that's manageable for this particular assessment. And then the criteria and indicators or evidence that you'll collect. So what is the criteria that you're using? Are you going to use indicators from the GRI? Are you going to inform an EMS? Are you going to look at whether the organisation is complying with regulations? Are you going to look at benchmarking from another organisation? Entirely up to you again, but you need to justify that choice and make it clear in your audit report as well as in your presentation. And then coming up with a data collection plan. How, who, when, where, answering all of those questions of how you're going to get that data collection happening. In terms of the criteria that you might use, this is really what you're comparing against. So one of the key things in doing an audit is you need to have this criteria set. So as I said before, you're going to look at laws and regulations and whether the organisation is meeting those. Are you going to look at license, permits or approvals? Corporate policies and procedures. Maybe the organisation already has a sustainability report and you're going to measure and monitor and compare to what is already happening within the organisation. Are you going to look at industry codes or EMS standards, the GRI as I mentioned previously, or maybe there's some stakeholder concerns that you're collecting data to audit against. Or as I said, previous audit reports. You could also look at that as a criteria. Then once you've set your criteria, you need to come up with some indicators. So exactly how are you going to measure what's going on in the organisation or indeed in the natural environment? So you can look at descriptive indicators. So these are not in relation to the organisation at all, but just a description of what's going on in the environment. So the State of the Environment report in Australia, or the WWF Living Planet report, are two examples of descriptive indicators. So it might be the number of trees per hectare or something similar to that. So it doesn't relate at all to the organisation and their operations, but it's just a description of what's going on in the environment, or parts per million of carbon produced in a particular area of atmosphere. Efficiency indicators are the next sort of indicator. So this is the quantity of inputs and outputs. So it allows you then to provide comparative data. So it might be carbon emitted per unit of good produced. So then, rather than measuring the amount of carbon that the organisation produces in net, you're measuring it per unit produced. So if production increases, are you getting more efficient, but still you're going to be producing more carbon? Efficiency indicators give you a different measure. So it's really up to you to decide what is the most appropriate measure of what you're measuring against. So setting that criteria and then choosing an indicator that matches against that criteria. And then performance indicators. So a comparison to a target or goal. So an ideal goal may be to have zero waste in the organisation, and how is the organisation matching up against that? So Interface Carpets is a good example of an organisation that set that zero waste goal. The good guys in Capalaba have a similar zero waste goal and measuring against that. And the next type of performance indicator is an identified target. So we see this in greenhouse gas emissions. So a 75% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions compared to 1990 levels. So we've got a target there and we can see whether or not the organisation is meeting that. There's also three other types of indicators. So this again comes from one of your readings. So environmental concern. So no, as I said before, no regard to the organisational activity. Management performance. And these are the measures that management are taken to meet environmental goals. So it might be the number of initiatives that are going on within the organisation. And then operational performance. So how is the organisation's operations impacted on the environment? So environmental damage caused by the organisation's operations, or an expansion of the land area required, or of the building of a new office, what impact would that have on the natural environment? So the operational performance of the organisation and the impact that that has. So now, once you've set those indicators, you've got your scope, you've got your criteria, you've set your indicators, and now it's time to go and collect your data. So you might look for data that is already available. So the example that I gave before of Queensland Rail, the students who did that, they were able to use data that had already been collected and do calculations to work out how much fuel was being wasted compared to how much was being, and how efficiently it was being used. But that was all based on existing records and invoices from different areas within the organisation. As I said before, preparing your work documents, so whether that's checklists and sampling plans, observational plans, forms for recording information, or interview schedules, that sort of thing. So that needs to be conducted before you go on site. And then once you go on site, you've got all your documents ready. You can conduct those interviews, you conduct the observations, and review the documents that you need while you're on site. And finally, preparing the audit report. So this is where you put it all into a document in order to present to the organisation, or in this case, present as part of your coursework. So the general audit would cover these things. And I've got a list here, but this is quite flexible depending on the particular scope and objectives of your audit. So have a look online for those examples and you'll see the way that other students have set out their audits. So an introduction, the date, objectives, the scope and criteria that you've used, who conducted the audit, who was consulted, your methods and procedures, your findings, conclusions and recommendations. What I'd also suggest, and what you need to do, is make sure you justify what you've done using academic literature. So that's going to be required throughout your report, making sure you justify everything that you've done and why you've chosen those criteria, why those measures are most appropriate. All of that needs to be backed up with academic, rigorous literature. Good luck.